Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. This is the third video in a series of installments relating to the mysterious web series Petscop. If you haven't seen Petscop, please do so before watching these videos. Believe me when I say that it's worth taking the time to do so. I'll have a link to the series in the video description. In this installment, I'll be going through videos 7 through 10. And I'll be referencing a number of points that have come up previously, so if you haven't seen my first two videos on this topic, please watch those before you check out this one. Having said that, let's get going. The seventh video was uploaded on April 29th, 2017. It starts off with Paul revisiting Quitter's room. He doesn't talk much. We can see that his mirror image is still there. It mimics all of his actions point by point. Paul moves to the upper right-hand corner of the room. His mirror image is out of view at this point. And let's take note of the time on the clock, 4:30. Though we have no way of knowing whether it's 4:30 a.m. or 4:30 p.m. We hear some rustling. It sounds as though Paul is flipping through some notes. His avatar is idle for a few seconds. A strange, slow-paced jingle begins to play. Now, assuming you've got your left and right speakers set up, the jingle only plays in the left speaker. This jingle gets Paul's attention. He moves to the left side of the room, and his mirror image is conspicuously absent. Footnote: I've attempted to analyze this jingle, and as best I can tell, there's not really anything all that remarkable about it. The jingle does seem to move from a series of disjointed notes to a more coherent melody, and music does seem to be an important component of the series. Recall that in the very first video, it was required of Paul to run on a treadmill, which adjusted his clone's position on a keyboard. Yes, it was convoluted, but solving that little puzzle allowed Paul to catch another so-called pet. Keep this in mind because it's going to come up again. Back to the video. When the jingle stops, Paul's mirror image pops back into existence. Again, it follows his movements precisely. Paul takes a look at the note again. Another backwards message appears. This time, it's bright purple. "Come here," it reads. There's a zigzagging line above the text. Paul returns to the object, and to his surprise, it already has a message displayed. It reads, "I love you. New maker, please show Marvin where his house is." Again, the object has turned purple. Based on this message, Paul deduces that Marvin must be the shadowy figure we saw in the previous video, since that very same character previously asked, "Where is my house?" Paul realizes that the object could change back to red at any point in time, so he uses the opportunity to ask a question. He asks, "Who are you?" The object does not answer this question, and instead displays another message. "Go there and he'll follow you. His daughter is there." This appears to be consistent with the last part of the shadowy figure's message in the sixth video. "I will follow." Recalling the message in Quitter's room, Paul asks, "Remember being born?" At this point, the video cuts forward and another message appears. Again, the object does not address Paul's question. Instead, it says, "Also wants 1,000 pieces for, quote, machine beyond the school basement stairway." The object stops glowing, and the video cuts forward to another point in time. Footnote: I have previously referred to the so-called pieces in this game as GIFs. I've used this shorthand for a number of reasons. The first and foremost of which is that I believe the game is conditioning Paul to continue playing. And by mere virtue of watching the gameplay, we are being conditioned as well. As stated previously, the appearance of so-called pieces often coincides with the satisfaction of Paul's intellectual curiosity. Information is given in a piecemeal fashion, no pun intended. Well, now, Paul has yet another incentive. He needs to collect 1,000 pieces. This concrete goal works in service of the conditioning process. Moreover, the game mechanic is now given a new connotation by virtue of its having been officially named. The term piece, in relation to the, quote, machine beyond the basement stairway, implies a larger system of operations in which said pieces are required to sustain or even perhaps start such an operation. But as always, we the viewers have no clear idea what this operation is working towards. It would seem that, in context, the operation might serve a certain end, bringing Marvin back to his home. And yet, we know that the tool has previously declared, "You'll never go home." I just want to point out that Marvin may have been taken away from his home for a good reason. We have some indication that he's exhibited violent behavior in the past. After all, the purple object previously said, quote, "Marvin picks up tool, hurts me when PlayStation on." Why is the very same entity now advocating for Marvin to be reunited with his daughter? It makes no sense. It's almost as though the purple object is being forced to relay these messages. First, out of nowhere, the object says, "I love you," and then it implores Paul to help Marvin find his house. The object then tells Paul to collect 1,000 pieces for the, quote, "machine beyond the school basement stairway." Now, if we think of these so-called pieces as the currency of this game, it almost seems as though the entity represented by the purple object is being held for ransom. Whatever the case, something is seriously wrong here. The message comes without any provocation whatsoever, and it is notably distinct from the voice previously exhibited by the purple object. Yet, Paul doesn't seem to notice this tonal discrepancy. And it is understandable why he didn't notice. After all, there are aesthetic similarities. This is the same purple object that previously relayed messages, and it's doing so in all caps. So the distinction is really in tone. And at this point, Paul's too invested in trying to figure out what's going on with Marvin to notice these subtle details. Back to the video. Paul walks past the "good grief" in a last text and goes up to the turnstile. He opens his start menu. The text in the upper right reads, "Take them home." Paul goes to his pet inventory and a message pops up. It says, quote, "Child library accepts people." The word "people" is in dark purple. Each time he tries to select one of his pets, the message reoccurs along with an adverse sound effect. Paul reviews his inventory and speculates that the 3 shadowy figures are indeed people. Paul exits his menu and walks frantically to the left, then goes back into his menu. Presumably, he's just making sure that the message only pops up when he's at the turnstile. But in the process, we the viewers are given a new bit of information. Paul selects a pet named Pen and quickly goes through its description. He scrolls through it far too fast for anyone to read, but I pause the video and here's what it says. Pen is an aspiring mathematician. She's entirely deaf. She doesn't know what sound is, let alone music. I don't know what she's doing here. Paul moves on. Footnote. So let's think about this description. Pen is deaf, meaning she's unable to perceive sound. As such, she has never heard music, and yet a specific musical interval was required to catch her. But the game associates musical intervals with numbers, and tellingly, Pen is a mathematician, so she can perceive numbers but not music. If Pen was an actual person, and if she was to approach this puzzle herself, she'd be able to figure it out based merely on the visual and numeric information displayed on the screen. But she'd be missing a significant component, the music. Perhaps Paul is missing something as well. If we think of music as a representation of sentiment, and math as a representation of logic, it would appear that the work is making a point about the limits of perception. Any moral approach must take into account the experience of other people. And yet, our protagonist selectively favors certain information which compels him to move forward, and he ignores information that actively discourages him from moving forward. Specifically, he ignores the message initially given to him by the purple object, quote, "Turn PlayStation off," and quote, "Marvin picks up tool, hurts me when PlayStation on." I would argue that Paul is conditioned to do so by the maligned game, and perhaps this comes at an untold cost. Maybe the series is making a larger point about the nature of certain incentives in our society. Think of the ways in which we are sometimes conditioned to selectively favor our own narrow interests over the well-being of others. Back to the video. The video cuts abruptly to Paul back to work at the easel. He generates a room and quickly explores the area. On the table, there's a blue model car and a Rubik's Cube. The carpet has a pattern containing stars, a gift box, and binoculars. Paul explains that he's entered the very same pattern on Michael Hammond's grave, except this time he's left off the eyebrows. This is presumably due to the enigmatic note he read in the third video. Quote, "Your wife says care isn't growing eyebrows. You say, that's a puzzle." Paul seems to think eyebrows hold some significance in the game. He tries another pattern. He explains that he's entered the pattern associated with care, except this time he's included eyebrows. Recall that in video 3, Paul generated a room associated with Care's face pattern, a pattern which did not contain eyebrows. It was a room devoid of color. There was a pack of crayons and an object we've come to recognize as the tool on the table. Well, this time, the room is shaded in purple. Paul looks at the table. It's got 3 building blocks with the letters C, R, and E. In addition, there's something to the right, but it's blocked out. Paul explains nervously that he's put Mike's eyebrows on Care's face. He seems a little taken aback. He's not sure if this particular room holds any significance, but he seems to focus on the censored item on the table. The video cuts abruptly to a black screen with a message. The message isn't for Paul. It appears to be for the viewer. We've had to cover something with a black box. Right now, we can't say why. Some other things we're expecting to, quote, censor in the future, quote, a big present with a sticker on it, quote, something on a wall in a black house, quote, written on a chalkboard. And that's the end of the video. Footnote. Note that the message says we. That's an interesting choice of words. After all, up until now, it might have been safe to assume that Paul has been uploading these videos all by himself. It would appear that, based on the context of this message, there's a number of people behind this operation, and there's no indication that Paul is even one of those people. It could be that these videos were found at a later date in the very same way that Paul found the video game, or alternatively, it could be that Paul has an accomplice. Perhaps it's the very same person he's spoken to in previous videos. But, if that's the case, why is there such an abrupt change in pacing and tone here? Why was it necessary at this specific point to directly address the audience? As far as I'm concerned, there's really no way of knowing based on the info we're given. What we can say for sure is that, for some reason, the parties that have uploaded these videos have decided to censor this item, and a few additional items in future videos. Okay. That does it for video 7. Video 8 was uploaded on May 9th, 2017. It opens with Paul inspecting a tunnel. It's the very same tunnel we previously observed in the second video. Cars speed through the tunnel, and if you take a look, they're actually enlarged versions of the model cars we've previously seen on the table in the bedroom at various points throughout the series. Interestingly, the game is programmed such that whenever Paul steps onto the road, the cars stop driving by. Footnote. So, at this point, Paul is covering an area that he's already explored, at least to some degree. Paul walked by this very same tunnel back in the second video. In that part of the series, we saw a glimpse of a car passing by. Now, if Paul noticed the car back then, he didn't seem to think it was all that remarkable. But I would venture to guess that he didn't actually notice it. At that point, I think he was a little too bewildered by the depth of the game's hidden level. Well, now, Paul is doubling back, taking another look at an area he's already traversed. So, I would speculate that he's run out of adequate leads in other parts of the game. And whatever it was that was blocked by the censor in the previous video has motivated him to be a little more thorough. Let's call to mind the description of the pet known as Tonit, as it appeared in video 6. This description was notable for its grim tenor, and it made reference to an incident involving a dog getting hit by a car. Cars seem to be a reoccurring bit of imagery in this series, and this description gives them a decidedly ominous connotation. Given this information, the fact that cars stop driving out of the tunnel whenever Paul positions himself in front of the path, well, that's pretty conspicuous if you ask me. Back to the video. A figure suddenly emerges out of the tunnel and begins walking quickly to the left. Paul is startled, but he has the wherewithal to follow the figure. Note that the figure's pace is slightly faster than that of Paul's. The figure leads Paul to inspect the picture of the brick building, which at this point, we'll just go ahead and assume is the school. Paul views the school, and the figure circles around him as if to emphasize the building's importance. The figure then leads Paul to the picture of the house and repeats the very same motions. Paul then speculates that this figure is Marvin, the very same shadowy figure that appeared in the trippy windmill interlude from video 6. And this makes sense considering the character's focus on the school and the house, both of which were explicitly referenced in the 6th video. Not to mention, the silhouetted figure in the 6th video has the same exact shape as this character. It should also be noted that the avatar has the exact same body as Paul's avatar, but an entirely distinct head. Marvin then walks directly ahead and, again, to the left, but this time, he walks right into a wall. Paul says, "I think you're confused, Marvin." Marvin circles around Paul just in the same way he did previously. Again, he walks to the left, directly into the wall. Then, Marvin disappears into the darkness. Paul attempts to follow him, but it's clear that he's gone. Paul speculates that Marvin elevated upwards, to the Newmaker plane, so Paul goes there to search for him. He doesn't find anything. The video then cuts to a later point in time. Paul is back at the point in the game where Marvin disappeared, and it sounds like he's talking to someone.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's not here now. There's not even a passageway or anything. Can you remember when you saw this? Well, it could have changed between then and 2004. After 2004, my mom had it reportedly.
Paul thanks the person, but the video abruptly ends before his sentence is finished. Footnote. So we've just gleaned a whole lot of new information in a very short amount of time. First things first, who is Paul talking to? Are we to assume that Paul is talking to the very same person he's been talking to since the beginning of the series? I think that's a reasonable assumption, but we really have no way to verify it at this point. Nonetheless, it sounds like the person on the other end of the phone has played Petscop before, and this, in and of itself, is a revelation. It sounds as though the person on the other end of the phone is claiming that a passageway once existed in the very same spot where Marvin ran into the wall here. So, Marvin's erratic movements are beginning to make some amount of sense. First, Marvin showed Paul the school, then the greenhouse. Keep in mind that Marvin previously inquired about both the school and the house, which he claims is his, in the 6th video. Well, it looks like Marvin would like to show Paul something else, but whatever it is, it's no longer there. Recall the tool's response when Paul inquired about Marvin's house. It said, quote, "You'll never go home." Further recall the tool's response when Paul asked about the school. It replied, "You can't go back in time." This response would seem to imply that the school no longer exists. Similarly, it seems this supposed passageway no longer exists. Has the game been altered since its creation? It is not exactly clear when the person on the phone last played the game, but we know it was prior to 2004, because that's when Paul's mom reportedly had the game. There's another revelation. Prior to this, we were working under the assumption that the game was just something Paul found. Now, it sounds as though the game has been in the family's possession for quite some time. That wraps it up for the 8th video. The 9th video was uploaded on May 24th, 2017. It begins at the start screen. The loading screen immediately follows. Note that it depicts an overpass with a road running through it. The game goes to a demo mode, something we haven't seen before. At this point, Paul hasn't said a word. The avatar traverses through the so-called gift plane and gets on the treadmill, the very same device Paul used to catch the pet known as Pen in video 1. But this time, the keyboard that was previously laid out next to the treadmill is gone. The avatar walks on the treadmill until the number is reduced from 16 to 3. The avatar stays on 3 for quite a while, then continues to 0. Footnote: there's a remarkable consistency to various factors in the game. For instance, let's take note that the number display on the treadmill alternates between red and pink. Even numbers are displayed in red, and odd numbers are displayed in pink. Let's harken back all the way to the very first video in the series. Remember the sign on the path leading into the gift plane? Well, it referenced a few numbers. The sign said that the gift plane once provided homes to over 100, quote, young pets, and a total of 48 remain. The sign encouraged the player to visit their 8 homes in the gift plane and, quote, find some friends to take home with you. Now, do you notice anything interesting about these numbers? Both the numbers 48 and 8 are displayed in red. What do these numbers have in common? Well, they're both even. So that's interesting in light of the fact that even numbers are also displayed in red on the treadmill. This is also an instance in which a correlation is implied between a puzzle in the gift plane and an anomaly in the level beneath the new maker plane. Recall that in video 2, Paul came across a giant daisy. This daisy appears in a structure that also houses the character known as Care NLM. She sits atop a platform in the basement of the building with her hands over her eyes. As Paul picked the petals off the daisy, it gradually lowered into the ground. Every other instance prompt a subtle red tint to the screen, perhaps implying some kind of negative consequence. This pattern with the daisy petals would appear to correlate with the fact that even numbers appear in red on the treadmill display. When Paul enters the building, the screen has a red tint. This is because none of the petals have been picked. 0 is an even number. The tint is removed when Paul picks the first petal, and it comes back when he picks the second one, and so on, so forth. This is one of many examples in which aspects of even care correlate with anomalies in the level below the new maker plane. Back to the video. The game freezes. After a few seconds, the screen goes black, and then the game starts up by the structure with Michael Hammond's grave next to it. At this point, I'm assuming that Paul is playing the game, but you wouldn't know it from listening because, again, he isn't saying a word. Paul walks into the lower level of the building where Care resides. She remains in the same state with a reddened, distorted face. Paul notices another anomaly when coming back up from the basement. At a certain point on the ramp, Paul is able to turn right and walk through the wall. This seems to defy the physics of the game. When Paul comes through the other side, his avatar is completely dark. He tries this trick a few times just to confirm that it works consistently. Footnote. Hey, remember that note Paul received with the game? Here's the relevant bit. I walked downstairs, and when I got to the bottom, instead of proceeding, I turned to the right and became a shadow monster man. So, it would appear that Paul has just become the so-called shadow monster man mentioned in this note. And if you take a look at the instructions, the specific directional code towards the end would seem to match up directly with the actions Paul has to take in order to become the so-called shadow monster man. The note says press down, 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 right. It was required of Paul to walk down the ramp, down to the very lowest portion of the ramp, but not so far that he goes into the basement. And then he had to walk to the right in order to make this transformation. Back to the video. The video cuts forward. Paul tries the same trick with the ramp leading up to the new maker plane. It doesn't work. Paul walks up to the camera and, to his surprise, there's a windmill there. Note that it's turning clockwise. Paul walks inside, and there's a bizarre-looking contraption with a face on it. It's spinning around in an eerie fashion. There's also a sign with a face pattern akin to the pattern associated with Care. The only real distinction is that the nose is slightly different. The windmill also contains a white object that resembles the tool from previous videos. Paul engages the object and subsequently collects a number of pieces. 50 to be exact. The screen goes dark for a moment. The contraption with the face on it conspicuously disappears, as though the contraption was composed of the very pieces Paul just collected. He exits the structure, and get this, the windmill is now turning counterclockwise. A low-frequency noise begins playing, and the video jumps forward again. Paul's avatar has changed back to normal. He's back in the new maker plane, and the windmill has mysteriously disappeared. So, it would seem that based on Paul's recent experience, that the windmill is only visible when Paul has transformed himself into the so-called shadow monster man. Now, recall that face on the sign inside the windmill, and further recall that eyebrows were conspicuously absent from this pattern, just like the pattern associated with Care. Paul enters the pattern from the windmill on the easel. The ground begins shaking and the game says, "You found her. You may visit her room." Paul enters the bedroom. There's a double of Paul's avatar next to the bed. It disappears into the upper right corner of the room. The room itself is devoid of color, save for the tool-like object on the table, and there's a little model windmill there as well. The carpet has a pattern containing cog-like shapes, as well as a series of triangles and circles. And there's a note on the wall. It reads as follows. You must have guessed, but I was looking through your things. I found that picture of you from 1977, standing in front of an old windmill with your friend. You went there and it was a bad idea. Your friend and the windmill both disappeared into thin air. Her sister was holding the camera. She took another picture minutes later. Just you, no windmill, and no friend. You married her sister, and years later, your friend was reborn as your daughter. Your wife won't admit this is true, but I know it because I found the evidence. Your friend never returned with you, and the windmill was gone. I went to see it myself. Where is it? What did you do? Rainer, Newmaker. Paul finishes reading the message and walks into the upper right corner of the room. Footnote. When Paul enters this room, an exact copy of himself is reading the note. Paul doesn't seem to notice this. It moves in a very specific way into the right-hand corner of the room, disappearing into the darkness. Well, a couple of minutes later, after Paul has finished reading the note, he moves in the exact same way. And as far as I'm concerned, this right here is the smoking gun with respect to the horrific nature of the game. Petscop, the game itself, was somehow able to extrapolate Paul's exact movements before he made them. Essentially, the game was able to predict the future, and it didn't predict some vague prophecy or anything like that. It knew precisely how Paul was going to move. I should also note that a darkened loading screen appears after Paul walks into the upper right-hand corner of the room. It depicts a so-called piece. When the game loads up, Paul finds himself in a hallway. It leads into a darkened room with two gift packages. There's a large cake in between them, and the cake has a P on it. There appears to be a framed display on the wall with a yellow pinwheel and a small piece of cake, both on a park bench. Paul opens the gift on the right and obtains a green key. Then he opens the gift to the left, and just as the message in the previous video indicated, the object is censored. But we can discern that it's red, and it appears to be spinning. Paul is notably disturbed by the contents of the gift package. The video cuts forward. Paul explores the darkened portions of the room and finds a hallway leading off to the left. There's another gift. He opens it and is transported into the darkness. We hear a high-pitched, angelic tone, and Paul ends up back in what I presume to be the darkened fields of the Newmaker plane. This time, however, there's a brick edifice. Check out the symbol above the door. Paul enters the building and there's a loading screen. He reappears back in the gift plane, but he's in an unfamiliar part of the level. Footnote. The symbols that scroll across the background in even care correlate with different portions of other parts of the game. For instance, take a look at the symbol scrolling across the background here. Remember that symbol above the door on the brick building? Yep, it's the same one. But the correlation goes way beyond that. I'll touch on this in my conclusion, so keep it in mind. So, it turns out that this is what's on the other side of the closed door that Paul previously wasn't able to go through in the very first video. He comes out the other end and winds up in the first room of even care. Paul goes through even care and reads all of the signs to see if any of them are different. Footnote. Paul goes through these messages so quickly that he doesn't seem to notice a small discrepancy. Previously, in the very first video of this series, the first sign in this room read as follows. When you're choosing a pet, find somebody that you like. You don't have to love them right away. Do you remember when I said this in my very first Petscop video? Tellingly, one of these signs implicitly grants personhood to these so-called pets. After all, you wouldn't traditionally refer to your dog as, quote, somebody. You wouldn't go to the pound looking for a dog and hear the proprietor say, find somebody that you like. They're far more likely to say, find one that you like. Okay, well, take a look at the sign now. It says, when you're choosing a pet, find one that you like. So, instead of somebody, it says one. Think about that for a second. Honestly, this just might be the creepiest thing in the series thus far. It's a very small detail, but I think it's an important one. The game previously granted the status of personhood to these entities called pets in the game. Now it's taking away that status in a subtle but menacing way. Back to the video. Paul walks on the treadmill and fiddles with it for a while. He lowers the number from 16 down to -1. The game freezes and it seems that Paul is flummoxed. He restarts the game and goes back to the lower level of the structure. And wouldn't you know it, we've got a new pet just waiting to be caught. The pet is labeled Care NLM. Here's her description. Care NLM escaped from the school's basement and wandered the Newmaker plane for days. To catch her, you had to lie, but it may not be a lie forever. You're the Newmaker. You can turn Care NLM into Care A and close the loop. Note that the triangle button next to Go Back is still flickering. And let's take note of another conspicuous message in the Start menu. It says, quote, "You're in the other place too." And there's yet another white box with a symbol on it. Does this one look familiar at all? It's the very same symbol that was scrolling across the screen in the room with the treadmill. Paul walks up to the building. He immediately goes up to the darkened window and opens the enclosure. He goes into his main menu. Note that the message in the menu is different. It reads, "The pets really seem to like you. Thanks for playing Petscop." Paul selects Care NLM. A message appears. You have decided to leave Care NLM. If you change your mind within 6 months, you can take Care NLM back. What month is it anyway? What year is it? At no point during this exchange does Paul explain what he's doing. He doesn't say anything. It doesn't appear as though he's really thought out his actions. Paul engages the turnstile, returning Care NLM to the bedroom. After this, he goes into the bedroom again. Care is on her bed, and she appears to be crying. Paul walks up to Care NLM and catches her again. And that's the end of video 9. The 10th video was uploaded on May 31st, 2017. It begins with Paul back in the gift plane. He still has a green key handy. Paul makes his way from the newly discovered portion of Evencare to the room containing the conjoined system of cages. Recall that this is the room where Paul caught Amber in the very first video. He goes to the right and switches the door closed and then open again. Paul proceeds to the left-hand cell and switches that door open as well. He hesitates for a moment, then attempts to leave the area. There's just one problem. The front door is closed. The game freezes, and it's probably safe to assume that Paul has restarted his system, since we see the title screen shortly thereafter. Paul scrolls through the profiles and quickly selects his game. Footnote. Recall that Paul previously created a test profile, and according to him, none of the same sorts of anomalies had occurred in said profile. Taking a gander at the respective profiles here would seem to confirm this account. Note that each of the respective profiles have varying piece counts which indicate the progress he's made on each of them. The original profile, as well as the backup, have 344 pieces, but the test profile only has 201 pieces. For reference, Paul had collected around 200 pieces by the end of the second video. So it can be reasonably assumed that Paul played up until that point in the test profile. But for consistency's sake, let's just recall that by the end of video 2, Paul had collected 212 pieces. So Paul didn't wait around very long for any sorts of anomalies to occur when he was testing out that new profile. Maybe he's not as scientific as he had previously claimed to be. I would venture to guess that Paul was simply too eager to keep making progress on his original game to thoroughly test out this new profile. At this point, Paul hasn't said a word throughout this video. The game boots up and Paul starts from the very same point in video 9 where he's transported through the gift. The video cuts forward and he moves through Evencare. He goes into the room with the conjoined cages, and this time he veers to the left. The cage door on the left is already open. Note that in the previous instance, the door on the left was closed. In a display of accomplishment, Paul says, "There you go." The video cuts forward, and Paul's back in the lower level of the game. Footnote. If you thought that the treadmill thing was convoluted, just wait till you get a load of this. Recall that Paul initially caught the pet known as Amber by locking himself in the prison cell. As a result, Amber jumped to the left side of the cell, seemingly encouraged by the notion that Paul would be staying in there. But after catching Amber, Paul circumvented the cell door by moving through an unseen passageway in the room. I previously wondered about the deceptive nature of this action. Well, now, it seems that it is required of Paul to pull off a similar feat here in order to reach the next part of the game. Except this time, he has to do something a little more complicated. By opening both cell doors, Paul has engaged a mechanism that causes the door leading to the Newmaker plane to shut. And remember, Paul's character doesn't know how to open doors. He's effectively locked himself in even care. So, Paul has to intentionally crash the game in order to get back to the Newmaker plane. Let's recall the term Panic SV in relation to both Paul's original profile as well as his backup. Many seem to think Panic SV stands for Panic Save, a function that saves the game in case of a crash. So Paul crashed the game as a workaround to circumvent the closed door in the gift plane. And with the help of the Panic Save function, Paul was able to do so while keeping the changes he made in even care. So what he's just done is analogous to his actions taken in order to catch Amber. Back to the video. Paul goes into Quitter's room and, surprisingly, he's able to access the left side of the room where his mirror image had previously resided. There's a white block on the bed with a symbol on it. Does that symbol look familiar? It should. It's the very same symbol that scrolls across the background in Amber's room. Paul looks at the note on the wall. It reads, "Do you remember being born?" Whereas previously the note was backwards on the right side of the room. This time, it's forwards. Note also the clock position is different on this side of the room. It's positioned at 5:05 instead of 4:30. Paul returns to the tool and inquires, "What month is it?" A blank calendar pops out of the tool. Paul asks, "What year is it?" The video jumps forward. Note that there's no calendar this time. Now, this would indicate to me that Paul has restarted the game. He asks the tool, "Where was the windmill?" A giant black box covers a majority of the screen, indicating that yet another item has been censored. At this point, the video abruptly ends. Petscop presents a series of signs which reoccur in various parts of the game. The matching symbols hint at a larger correlation. Events that occur in the gift plane seem to influence events that occur in lower levels of the game. The symbol on the white block in the lower level of the structure where Care NLM is caught is the very same symbol that scrolls across the background in the room with the treadmill. In order to catch Care NLM, Paul has to adjust the treadmill to -1. Similarly, the symbol that appears on the block in Quitter's room is the very same symbol that scrolls across the screen in the room with the conjoined cages. Paul has to engage the switch to the left to open the cage door, which subsequently gives him access to the left side of Quitter's room. I would further speculate that other portions of even care correlate with aspects of the lower level of the Newmaker plane. In other words, these two levels are mutually associated with one another. This works to formulate a connection in the player's head. In a way, the game creates its own contextual language. But we have to keep asking the question, to what end? What is the game working towards? The reoccurrence of these signs seems to suggest a formal, internally consistent set of rules. But the logical relation of these signs in subsequent events is ambiguous. It is merely suggested. We never get the big picture, we only get small slices of context. I would argue that this ambiguity is an inherent part of the work. It's not a bug, it's a feature of the series. On to another topic, the censors. Some casually dismiss the censors as a cheap plot device, but I have yet to see such critics address the following question, which inevitably arises from this line of criticism. Cheap in relation to what? If it is not yet clear the purpose of such a device, and I haven't heard a coherent account for it as of yet, how can you just offhandedly dismiss it? Paul's emotional connection to the game is one of the functions of the censors throughout the story. The censored items exist for the very same reason that the series uses the Let's Play format. They are a plot device used to heighten the immediacy of the viewing experience. The censors do this first by eliciting a sense of mystery. Why are the items censored, we wonder? What purpose does this serve? Paul's intuitions are often more telling than his logical deductions. His various reactions to the censored items betray the sense of skepticism he exhibits in earlier parts of the series. In the very first instance, he is mildly perplexed.
Because everything looks like any other room. Except it puts this here. Except it puts this. I don't know, maybe that's just something that it puts in any room.
In the second instance, he is bewildered.
What the fuck?
Now, this raises a question. Why is there a discrepancy between these two reactions? One might assume that the question is unanswerable without knowing exactly what is being censored. But let's think about it. It would appear that based on Paul's initial reaction, the first censored item is not something that would immediately shock him. It's not something violent or pornographic or anything like that. These are just a couple of possible reasons why an item might be censored in a YouTube video. Ask yourself, what might be another reason an item would be censored on the internet? It could be that the item works to identify Paul in some way. Maybe the parties that have uploaded the video don't want to give the audience any information that might allow someone to track him down. I'm operating under the assumption that the first censored item vaguely connects to Paul in some personal way. The work signals this to the audience by mitigating Paul's response to seeing the first censored item. Paul's reaction is not one of immense shock, rather it's a reluctant sort of curiosity. The item does seem to grab Paul's attention. I believe this is because it holds some significance for him personally, but it's vague enough that he's able to plausibly dismiss it as a coincidence. Again, he writes off a strange occurrence to mere circumstance. As noted in my previous videos, this is a consistent character trait that Paul exhibits. He's a skeptic. But perhaps Paul's skepticism is a bit misplaced given the circumstances. Now, I've talked before about how one plot device can serve multiple narrative functions in the story, and I believe that's the case with the censored items. Up until the point when Paul finds the first censored object, he had a dispassionate sort of interest in the game itself. However, Paul's attitude changes after having seen the first censored item. Note that he gradually gets less and less prone to speaking as the series progresses. I believe this is because he's more intent on moving forward than he is in talking. Paul's personal connection to the game becomes all the more evident in the 8th video when it is casually revealed that Paul's mother was previously in possession of the game. Then, Paul loses his composure when he sees the next censored item. Based on this, I believe the game is now alluding to him, first subtly, and then explicitly. So, in one sense, the censors connect Paul in a personal way to the events that take place inside the game. They raise the stakes for him. In another sense, we can think of the censored items as a way to connect the viewer with the true horror of the story. The censors enable the viewer to imagine themselves in Paul's situation. All you really have to do is imagine your own personal objects in the censored boxes. Alright, so winding down, I had originally planned on wrapping up my coverage of the 10 videos that now constitute the Petscop series in this here 3rd installment. But in the process of writing up my final thoughts for this one, I realized that there was simply too much to say. So I'll be doing one more video dedicated to this topic. In my 4th installment on Petscop, I'll tie up a few loose ends with respect to a number of points I previously mentioned, and I'll do my very best to offer a cohesive interpretation of the series. And yes, I am aware of the updates made to the Petscop YouTube channel since the last video was uploaded in May. Rest assured, I will go over it. My hope is that by the end of my analysis on this topic, you'll have another way to think about the series. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Thank you for watching, and good night.